Hello, I'm working on my APQS Lucey. I have a customer's quilt loaded onto my machine. And the first thing I do before I even put it on my bars, I'm not a floater. I put everything on the bar. I find that gives me the best results, so that when it comes to fully down, if they're off in their length, it kind of keeps everything in the same roll as you advance, and I can get everything quilted and as square as possible for the customer. So the first thing I do is I measure the top width and the length, but I do it 3 spots. I do it up here at a stable seam. I don't always do it right here at the edge because this stretches a lot. So I try to find a good stable seam to do my first measurement. Then I go into the middle of the quilt and I'll measure it again. I'll find a good seam there. And I normally put it over my bars because my bars, I can get it nice and smooth. If it's on the floor, if it's on a table, it's a little harder to do that. So before I even load it, any of this fabric, I will measure everything. So I'll put my top on this bar right here, which is the backing bar, and I'll measure this first seam, the middle seam, and then the end. And this one happened to be 49 inches, so I was really lucky with getting that one. Sometimes they don't always work out that way, but she did a good job at getting it that way, so I didn't really have a problem. But if it wasn't, what do you do? So I always work with the lowest number. So let's just say maybe it was a 50 in one spot. Maybe it was a 50 up here, but it was like a 49.5 in the middle, and maybe like a 50.25 on the bottom. Well, I'm going with the lowest number. I'm doing the 49.5, and that's where my tape comes into play really well for me. So I would then get the quilt to go in those measurements. I'll normally take a clip to get it to where it needs to go. I'll come up here to the top. I have my leader centered as well, and I'll measure with a ruler to where it needs to be. I'll divide that measurement in half. So if I needed it to be a 49.5, I would then divide that measurement so half of it comes all right down here, and I would take a corsage pin and just stick it right where it belongs. And I would come over here to this side, and I'd measure all the way down to the half that I needed. Put my little pin straight in. When I do my basting stitch across, I have my channel locks on. I make a horizontal line. I line everything up to that point. I then can adjust and pin based on how I had marked it. So that's if you had a troublesome one where it wasn't measuring what you needed, and then you would ease it in and then use your basting technique. So you notice I have a lot of corsage pins all the way around this quilt. Okay, I have not basted it down to the quilt yet. I wanted to make sure I measured correctly. Everything's correct. It looks straight. It looks pretty square. And I corsage pinned it around. Now I'm going to take the time to then baste it with long basting stitches. And I will start in my center, work my way down, and then go down from here. Then I'll come back, do it again, go from the middle all the way down and back. That way it is not pulling fabric in different ways than I want it to. So let's take my machine, and I would just come over here to do my thing. Pull it, knot it, so you can see I'm doing that. And then you want to I kind of take my fingers behind it as I go, and I'll do needle up and down as I go across. So just imagine, so just what the needle down looks like, go over just a little bit, go over just a little bit, kind of like that process. And if you've noticed it's getting kind of wavy, you can kind of walk along that. And you kind of get the point. I'm going to go all the way across here, all the way down, secure it. Then I come back up here to my middle, and I will needle up and down till I get to the max that I can do in my space. And I kind of keep an eye on my tape too. So I know I'm in the center, or kind of near the center, because of the way it measures from my center and how it looks from up here. But my main concern really is not really the numbers so much. I know what it measures and I add it together and it's 49. But I need to make sure that it advances and stays in its place. So where I've clipped this, I'm going to check for after each roll to make sure that this is not going too far out, too far in, that I kind of get it in just right there. And that might take some playing around with, because fabric can shift and change as you quilt it. So at least I know it's feeding at the measurements I want it to be. And same thing over here. I have another binder clip and I secure it, and I just kind of keep an eye on watching it. Okay, keep an eye on watching it as it goes. I don't necessarily need to do these pins after the first round. If it's really wavy, you may want to. That's how I get it to kind of play around with it first before I baste it with my up and down stitch. But it depends on your quilt. So this is pretty tight. So if I come over here, you know, I have it pretty tight, so I know it goes right across where I need it to go for my measurements. But the most important thing is if I'm sticking it right there, it needs to feed the same way each time. So I just make sure I check that after each roll. All right, hope that helps. When I get down to the bottom, you know, it's pretty much, because it's on this roll, it's pretty much straight. I don't have any smileys or frownies. And I just basically, because it's kind of already pinned to this top roller, I'll just put some more pins across, take off the pins that held it to the roller, and then I just baste it down, steam it, baste it down, and finish my quilting. All right, hope this helps. Hello, this is Tara from Chaley's Couture Quilting with my APQS Lucey, and I have finished basting with stitch up and stitch down across my quilt. It looks pretty square. I kind of visually inspect to make sure my lines look good. You know, quilts are all going to be different, so there's never going to be a perfect quilt that comes into your studio. So just kind of make sure that it looks as square as possible. And with those corsage pins, I have removed all of them now. So now that it's fully basted, when I advance it, I'm going to keep making sure that it's at the places I need it to be for each advance. And I will only pin the corsage pins if I find that the border is wavy. If it's fullness in the inside, I'm going to use a lot of steam. I have a little handheld steamer that I use on this. Now that I've finished basting, I can put my clamps back on. I can do my test. I like to test for points, circles, swirls, different speeds, and I'll look underneath the quilt to make sure that it looks good under there too. I'm always looking underneath, between passes, between bobbin changes, making sure that the tension is good. That's important. But once you get and start and use that time to really set up and make sure that this quilt is square on your long arm, it's gonna work out well for you. I don't do a full running stitch because I find that if I fully run down with the stitch I would quilt with, I find that I don't get very good results, especially if it's a challenging quilt. I find if I can just do needle up and down in certain spots and more in some places that I feel are really full, I get better results that way. I can ease it in, and it just works out really well with needle up and down for me. If I'm doing custom, I'll use those corsage pins throughout the whole thing. I'll also baste, large basting across my belly bar and go from there and advance down and stabilize it before I really get into the quilting. Sometimes I will do a little bit at a time where I baste. It really depends on the quilt, what the shape of the quilt is. If it was something like this, corsage pins all throughout this first level, I'll just do stitch in a ditch around the pineapples, advance it, baste it with pins and thread again. Then I'll stitch in a ditch until I get all the way down. And then when I need to go and do the really heavy quilting, then I'll come back and really work it in here. That way I know that it's square before I start really hammering down into it. But this one's going to be an edge to edge. Okay, so just something a little bit to add. I forgot to say the clamps are off, because the clamps are just kind of like an extra way of giving more support to your backing so you don't get wrinkles on the top or the back. And I like to do my basting before I put clamps on, because that just kind of just makes everything work out well. It's like magic. All right, stay tuned for some more tutorials from Shelley's Couture Quilting.